Hi, my name is Remy Perry. I'm with the Brain Injury Association of York Region, and I represent caregivers. Well, all that started 9 years ago when my wife and I were in a pretty serious car accident that left her with post-concussion syndrome. We were told by experts in the insurance companies that it was going to resolve itself in 6 months. Well, 9 years later, she still has it, and I've learned an incredible amount as a caregiver, enough to know that there's lots more for me to learn. So we've started a little while back about this podcast to talk to experts that I wish I'd talked to more than almost a decade ago, and so that other caregivers can really benefit from this. So today I'm speaking with Daniel Carroll. He is Senior Partner and Disability Finance Specialist, that's quite a mouthful, with Hudson Wealth and Trust Planning Group. Welcome, Daniel, and thanks for talking to us.
Thanks, Remy. Glad to be here.
Your firm is fairly unique when we compare it to other financial planning firms like Edward Jones, RBC Dominion, Raymond James, etc., Desjardins. What sets your firm apart? Why would someone come to you in particular who is in the situation we're in?
Well, what gave, I guess, birth to this firm was the need for someone with an expertise in planning for people who have disabilities. I came from the world of structured settlements many moons ago, and in that world, which of course is just a single annuity product designed to really stretch the money, or as I like to say, it does protect the money, but it doesn't necessarily protect the individual. And I felt in that time of my life that there needed to be more planning, more involvement of other things, because there are so many areas of disability finance, from government benefits to tax credits to incentive programs to return to work style programs, and all of these different things that were out there. And in working with clients at that time, even in the structure days, was very hard to find. And it was very difficult to navigate all of the rules and subtext. And every time you talk to one person, they seem to give you a differing opinion from the last person you spoke to. So I set out in my practice originally just as a young financial advisor to learn this and then to apply it in the space at first in the world of motor vehicle collisions. But it grew from there. And in fact, my practice blew up very quickly, and to the point where I took on a junior in my first 6 months to handle the volume, simply because there was such a need for this, for somebody who could provide answers to the questions that you cannot get from a website. And then it grew into the corporation, into the firm, and we've since taken on multiple advisors since who want to work. And it's very rewarding work. You're working with people who are struggling in life, who need sound financial advice. And at the end of the day, when you construct a financial plan in this space and people, there's that palpable moment where people realize it's going to be okay. That's really what kept it going and kept it growing. So from there, many moons later, now it's a full service firm offering financial planning to people with disabilities beyond the auto space, and in Ontario, and actually opening in the Maritimes this year as well.
Well, that brings to mind two questions. The first is, the other financial firms that are out there, would they not know about a lot of what it is that you had to inform yourself on? If I went to a general RBC Dominion, whatever, would they not know about a lot of the specialty stuff that you talk about?
They don't. And I'll be perfectly honest, I had no idea the size of the elephant I was trying to eat when I first set out to do this. And when I ran into complicated files in the early going of my practice, I literally spent months going down different rabbit holes to try to find a clear and definitive answer. And it required hours and hours and hours of research. And part of the problem with the financial services industry writ large is that most practitioners are sole practitioners. They may be sole practitioners under an umbrella like RBCDS or CIBC Wood Gundy or Edward Jones, but they generally run their own practice. And once in a while, a client will come to them with a disabled child or a spouse who's been involved in a motor vehicle collision or something, and they have to start this exploration.
The process that you went through.
That I spent months in, and then again, as the firm grew, with my two partners also spending months building on what I had originally gathered from information, but going even further to the point where we were on the phone for hours with ODSP, which is an almost impossible feat because ODSP doesn't call you
Yeah.
back. And in particular, caseworkers don't want to speak to financial professionals because they don't want to misstep. So you need to get to the upper brass of ODSP in particular to be able to get those kind of high level, fine detail answers to questions. And that took quite a while. And then it took clients and it took having multiple clients and multiple touch points with ODSP to be able to get that response. And it was interesting because what ultimately sort of dragged us down that rabbit hole was submitting proposals and then having them come back with either acceptances with caveats or tweaks or whatever, that then we learned and we grew and we had developed and we adapted to the point where now we're quite comfortable submitting to ODSP knowing that our plans will be approved based on everything we learned. And there were times when we'd have to go back and say, we need clarification on this ruling. And then again, so unless you are doing that day in, day out for multiple clients, you're likely not going to have that depth of knowledge. And I can give you one example with one of the big five banks, where a client of ours now, who originally started with the bank, went in to set up an RDSP, and they mishandled that structure so poorly that we had to get them to undo it. And at first they refused to undo it, which caused problems with CRA, and we actually had to threaten to sue them. Well, we didn't. It was the client's lawyer who had to step in and write a threatening letter to the bank for them to then go on bent knee to CRA to have it reversed. Because it's kind of one of those things that once you do it, it can be done. So it just shows that this isn't general knowledge. It is easy to misstep. So even a seasoned financial professional, as was involved in this case, missed the mark grossly.
Wow. So how often does that happen? How many of your clients that come to you late, for example, they've had financial advisors. It's not that their portfolio is a mess but it needs tweaking. They maybe missed some things that they could have gotten. How often does that happen where you're basically fixing others' mistakes?
It used to happen more frequently. I find less so now. I think they're more, certainly in the world of personal injury and medical malpractice, the lawyers know my firm. So we are generally getting involved earlier. And we actually launched a service to prevent some of these missteps. So more lawyers and case managers and occupational therapists are becoming aware of it and are referring clients to us early for that ounce of prevention approach. So we don't get the broken fix kind of thing. Although I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are in that situation, but neither they nor their advisor are aware of it. And it took in that case, what happened in the one case where they came to us for a fix was the client had settled the tort side of his file and had gone to the bank to deal with that money. And then when the accident benefits settled, his lawyer had said, "Oh, maybe you should go check these guys out instead." And that's when we realized all the mistakes that had been done. But I don't think, had we not been involved in that at that point, nobody probably would have caught the mistake.
So most of your referrals are from occupational therapists, from clinicians, from health professionals, or lawyers?
Both. We get a lot from both.
Because I met you at the Acquired Brain Injury Conference back in December, and I didn't know about your firm. I didn't know what the type of value added that you could provide for people with disabilities and their caregivers until I talked to you. Do you do any advertising outside of that or outside of referrals from healthcare professionals?
We don't advertise as much. I always think of advertising a bit like carpet bombing,
Yeah.
which is just, and because our service is pretty niche, we're talking to millions of Ontarians, how many have disability who could benefit from this? So there aren't a lot of channels that are focused that would be targeted enough for advertising. So we do a lot of educational seminars through brain injury associations and Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. We do a lot of work with them. We do our best to educate lawyers. So we go to their conferences. And then where you and I met, which is of course much more focused on care services, occupational therapy, and case managers. We're out at those conferences to try to educate. And we've made a couple of attempts to get a little podium time to get that message out a little bit more broadly, but we don't seem to get accepted. I think because the general focus of those conferences is more on the clinical practice, that when the financial guys step up, they seem to paint us with the brush that we're simply trying to advertise. And we're not. We are, of course, there's an intrinsic
Of course.
marketing value to it,
Mhm.
but I'm trying to get this information out, which is why, again, most of that happens by way of webinar through various disability groups.
I think that that may be some of the frustration a lot of the people watching this might feel, is that they didn't, I mean, unless you have an OT that knows about your particular services, you're not going to know. You're just going to use the financial planner and advisor that you've been doing, if you have one, up till now. We didn't know about you. Do you find that that's better now that that more OTs now know about you, that they're spreading the word? You're getting a lot more business than you can handle. Are
We're
you know?
growing rapidly, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
Are you unique in Canada? Or are you the only firm that specializes in this?
I've seen a few other, again, sole practitioner. I haven't seen a firm that claims to specialize in financial planning for disability. There are a few, again, advisors out there, and in many cases, either have a disability themselves or have a child with a disability or a spouse with a disability, and that's what sort of pulled them into the space. And they're applying their knowledge to their practice. I don't know that there's another firm out there, and again, particularly one that specializes in planning rather than just investing in account strategy.
How now you mentioned that you started primarily with MVAs, motor vehicle accidents, and accidents that produced brain injuries or other disabilities, and then you had to expand. Is the financial planning, what is the real difference between someone who has, for example, a brain injury from a stroke, as opposed to someone who acquired one from a motor vehicle accident or some other accident?
Not a whole lot. In all honesty, when it comes to I guess ultimately at the end of the day, it's an insured loss versus an uninsured loss. And the difference in that would be the amount of available resources. If there isn't an insurer backing up the loss, then people, unless they have saved prior to the event, are often far more restricted in their available resources. So it does make planning more difficult, but the same tactics or the same strategies often
Mhm.
apply, which is these are the government services you should avail yourself of. This is where you're going to go to offset costs, to reduce expenses, to increase income, and these sorts of things. And then again, strategies from the estate perspective, because of course, in many of those cases, people are wholly reliant on receiving assets or wealth from testators. So from an uncle or an aunt or parents who are going to
Someone who's passed, yeah.
assets to them through their estate or through estate planning. So a lot of that strategy and a lot of those elements do apply. It's more difficult, obviously, from can we make ends meet, or can we make this functional, or can we keep this person above the poverty line? It's a lot harder without that insured loss or without an insurance company backing it up.
Does age make a difference too?
Strategically, of course, yes. And again, every person's life is different. Every scenario is unique. There's no cookie cutter approach to this. You cannot slap this into a printer press and have it fly. It just doesn't work. So from age, yes, strategy is different. Are we talking about an RDSP? Not if the person's over 49, probably can't contribute to it. It does still have some tax advantage and estate considerations, but there's no Canada Disability Savings Grant or bonds to be had in that account after age 49. When we're talking about a much younger person, strategically, whether as a dependent, when and how we start to deploy assets or calculate benefits and things like that, that changes, of course, from sub 18 to 18 and beyond. So for sure, age is a factor. And of course, at the end of the day, the timeline, how long are we going to have to stretch assets over? And then, of course, the amount of available assets will dictate the amount of tolerance to risk. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of moving parts there. And again, every single case is very different.
And I imagine the severity of the injury too, and whether that person can work or not and acquire income. or whether they're completely dependent on ODSP or whatever else,
For
whether they can
sure.
invest.
And it can also come down to a matter of legal capacity. If the person does not have capacity to make decisions on their own and enter into contracts or open financial accounts, which you cannot do if you do not have capacity, then it's a whole different world, because we're likely into trust planning at that point, and we are dependent on trustees, which is often family members. Although not exclusively family members, we do look to use professionals and professional trustees services in many of those cases. So capacity is a big component.
I have some questions now that was based on, you did an amazing presentation a couple years ago with Janice Bellman from your firm on a bunch of different financial tools that can be employed for people with disabilities. And there were some questions that I had based on that. Starting with the disability tax credit was an amazing find for us when we first found out about it. We realized when we first were told about it, our health professional told us, well, you're not disabled enough to qualify for that. And we went, okay, and didn't apply for it.
Yeah.
And then we talked to, of all people, a tax specialist, and she said, no, there are people that are far less disabled than your wife that are taking full advantage of this. And it's all in how you apply. You talked a little bit about that in the presentation. Could you reiterate some of that?
Sure. It really does come down to which treating physician, which is the language that CRA uses in the application, or the treating physician who completes the medical component of the application is very critical to the success of that application. In general, when we speak about having a GP or a family doctor, which is who a lot of people turn to fill this out,
Right.
GPs are often functional medicine people. They look at your ability to stand, to walk, to lift a fork to your mouth. And if you can do those things, generally speaking, they think you're not so disabled that, and if you, it's no fault of their own. If they read the qualifications on that application, which often speak to it must take you 3 times as long to do a task as somebody of the same age without a disability.
Right.
And what gets missed from the functional side of things is, no, it doesn't take 3 times as long to get a fork to my mouth. What takes 3 times as long is the ability to go to the grocery store and to be able to tolerate the lights and the sounds and the stimuli in that space, to be able to complete a grocery order. So yes, I can operate a stove, I can cook, I can cut my food, I can put it in my mouth, chew, swallow, and I'm fine. But I cannot tolerate going to that store. And if I live alone and I do go to that store, I might complete part of an order at first attempt, and I may have to go back again and again. Now there's your 3 times as long. In fact, it's far more,
Right.
because the drive to and from the grocery store can also be overwhelming, and there can be days when it's just not possible. They're just not up to it. So generally speaking, in the world, particularly in the world of acquired brain injury or concussion,
Right.
we talk about people's tolerance to stimuli far more in this space, and it's just a little bit outside that scope of practice for a GP. And again, no fault of their own. So generally speaking, when I'm advising a client who is a survivor of ABI or stroke or any brain injury of any type,
Mhm.
is to turn more to a treating psychologist or psychiatrist, because they will have an understanding more of the effects on life. And that's the other thing that's really important in that application, is not to speak in terms of diagnosis, but to
Oh,
speak in terms of effect. Because CRA used to use nurse practitioners to review these applications. They don't anymore. It's any fresh out of a BA program, perhaps, or
really?
maybe a baby BCom, but anybody who got a job at CRA, it might be them who gets put on these files. And they're simply they have a checklist and they have an application, and they're going through that application looking to check off enough boxes to say you qualify. And I know it's terrible, but it actually did accelerate the application process. It used to take months and months and months. Now it happens much more quickly. But again, if the doctor isn't using the right language, then it's very hard for that CRA employee to check the boxes. And that's
Okay.
why, again, and a lot of times what I have done with clients is to sort of write an email that they can send to their psychologist to say, look, this is what I'm not telling the doctor what to say, but I'll tell them what CRA is looking for. And what I see in working with that client in their ability to complete a discovery process or to complete an application. When we start to see impairment in executive function, of course, it's going to take them longer to get through the
Of course, yeah.
day-to-day things of life. And again, not necessarily is that going to be visible in a 20-minute to half-hour meeting with the GP or appointment. So that's really important. And it's again, to get that, the effects, the functionality, to get that language into that application, that makes all the difference in the world.
And one of the things that as a caregiver that I watch in terms of my wife is, even if she's able to do a task, she'll pay for it, right? So in other words, she might be able to say wash the dishes, but it'll put her out for the afternoon, right? Or sweep the floor, or simple things in order to maintain your house. So yes, you can do it, but at what cost? And
Exactly.
that probably needs to be in there. Now, when you're saying that often when a GP submits it, or when it's submitted and it can be rejected, can it be appealed?
It can, yes. I believe you can appeal up to 3 times. It might be application plus 2 appeals. I think is, if I'm thinking back now to those research days,
Right.
it's application and 2 appeals.
Right.
And then after that, you're stonewalled. So again, it's not something you can just keep kicking at the can over and over and over again.
Right.
So, and it's in everybody's best interest who is applying to get it right out of the gate, because there is turnaround time, there is lag time, and that can have a ripple effect. So from my perspective and what we do in the motor vehicle space, if somebody comes to us at settlement and their money is either sitting at the insurer waiting to be transferred, or it's sitting in the lawyer's trust account, and they're asking us to put together a financial plan, and I don't have a disability tax credit in place, I'm waiting months before I know if I can use an RDSP. And knowing or not knowing whether or not I have access to $90,000 in government grants and bonds, well, that makes a massive difference in the type of strategy I'm deploying in a plan. It makes sense to get this right out of the gate as best you can and as early on as possible, because when things start to get moving, not only does it hold up the planning process, but if we look at the way this happened last year, where the stock market had, wonderful returns, if I was waiting on 6 months to get this done, that's
Missing a lot
6
of
months of
opportunities.
growth that is lost. And I can reach back for grants, we can reach back for bonds, we can never reach back for growth.
And if you were saying in the presentation that it can be accepted sometimes if it's sent in by a GP, or it's not perfect, but sometimes it's provisional for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. Can that be changed? Can you reapply after?
Yes, at the end of each of those periods of temporary acceptance or temporary approval, you want to apply a few months ahead of time for either a renewal or an extension.
To allow the lead time. Yeah, absolutely. So can it apply to more than one disabled person, for example? So in other words, well, let me give you an example. The disability tax credit for my wife, I'm going to be using for 2 years in which she had no taxable income. She was on LTD, which is of course not taxable, long-term disability. And so for those 2 years, I did have an income. And boy, the hoops I have to jump through with the CRA to be able to use that, we're still waiting. And we applied almost 2 years ago. One thing that we did is that the DTC is retroactive. In other words, in the sense that you can refile tax returns, like her tax returns for those years when she didn't have a DTC. Now that if it goes all the way back to the accident, she can refile it. It costs us a few $100s to refile, but we got thousands back in terms of tax benefits. Do you find that that's something that you do with your clients a lot?
Absolutely. Yeah,
okay,
and so the 2 components that you touched on, number one, who does the credit apply to?
Right.
Generally speaking, we would put it to the person with the higher income in a spousal scenario.
Right.
Because of course that has a percentage factor too, and it might make a change in the marginal tax rate, and there's lots of other considerations that come into play there. So generally speaking, we would apply the credit to that person, and then of course that should be on the application. Otherwise, as you said, you've now experienced the hassle of having it changed. So applying changes in this space is often very difficult. And then the other thing you said, that you can reach back in time to have those credits applied to previous filings. And that makes a difference, again, not only in the disability tax credit component, So you
Mhm.
adjust previous returns, which brings money back, but it also does allow us to capture past dated grants and bonds in the RDSP.
Oh, I'm going to ask a few more questions on that. Now, if, for example, a scenario where you are a caregiver for two people, you might have a wife who, like my own, who is involved in a car accident, has become disabled for that, qualifies for the DTC, and say you have an elderly person or somebody else who has a stroke or whatever else, can the DTC be transferred to two DTCs to one person? Has
That's
that
a good
ever
question.
happened? Because
That's not
that kind of occurred to me that sometimes people are in that situation where they're looking after more
more than
than.
one person. Yes, of course. To be honest, I would have to look into that a little further. I've not come across it in my practice as yet. That's the thing. I 10 years
Constantly
in
learning.
business and I'm still constantly learning. Yes. So whether or not and would the credit, I can't see why
And would it
not
be
thinking
compounded? In other
logically.
words, would it be a one-shot deal? That's it, or can it add up?
Generally, so this is a question for an accountant. So we use in our stable of professionals, accountants that have expertise in disability as well. And whether or not those credits could be layered, I would want to defer to him for that, or again, do a little more research on my own to be able to answer that question. Sorry, I don't
Do
have
you,
that one in my hip pocket.
that's fine. Do you find that the rules change a lot, that you're always playing catch up? Is the government coming down with something new each time, or are they?
They are tweaking things. They are adding things. So 2024 was supposed to be the release for the Canada Disability Benefit payment that the Trudeau government passed into law, but then we're working with the provinces to and the insurance companies, of course, to ensure that the legislation prevented any clawbacks from provincial programs or private insurance. So that's one that we've been watching and keeping an eye out, but it still hasn't really come to full fruition at this point. Despite the fact, of course, it was promised late in 2024, and here we are, the beginning of 2020.
Well,
But there's new things that do come out. The rules do change from time to time. Generally speaking, the sort of deeply ensconced components don't change much, but we did see when Stephen Harper's government took over from the Martin government, they ratcheted up the qualifications for the disability tax credit. And then when Trudeau took over, it was softened again, but not taken as far back as it was under Chrétien and Martin. So qualifications for programs and the finer nuance of these programs, they do change from time to time.
and that brings me to my next question. I know a lot of people watching this, depending on when it is that they watch it, we're looking at, in fact, probably a change in government to a much more conservative government. Have you heard anything? Has Pierre Poilievre, who may be our next prime minister, has he said anything about any of the financial tools that are available for people with disabilities? And I'm talking RDSPs, the child benefit, any of that. DTC.
Oh, and this is a problem too, because relative to the greater population, the disabled Canadian population is relatively small, and therefore I feel like they don't have a whole lot in their platforms that speaks to it. Or speaks to any component of disability. And certainly Stephen Harper, when he came in, he made no announcement that he was going to make it much more
No.
difficult to qualify for the disability tax credit.
And yet he did anyway.
And he did. And of course, they feel that they can get away with this because the limited number of persons with disability doesn't affect the greater outcome of a vote, right? Or an election.
Right.
So we don't see that there's enough vocal force or mobility in elections or in election cycles from Canadians with disability that they can bring attention to this. And of course, a lot of this stuff slides under the radar of the media too. They don't go after it because it's not going to be the front page story of the Globe and Mail or even the 30th
Sure.
clicked article on any one of these sites. So this stuff happens unannounced, behind the scenes, quietly, and certainly for the Harper government, it was one way to reduce expenditure of the government, because if they tightened up the qualifications for the DTC, fewer people got those benefits on their tax returns, and fewer still managed to capture the $90,000 of grants and bonds in the RDSP.
So that makes it more challenging for you as a financial planner if things get more difficult in terms of advising your clients.
Well, it certainly keeps us on our toes, and it will shift strategy from time to time. And again, that the rules of the 3 times as long as somebody with, I think the Harper government was 90% impaired the 100% of the time, was something to that. It was very restrictive to qualify for. And then Trudeau scaled it back, as I mentioned, to sort of 3 times as long as somebody of same age without a disability. So it kind of, but it's just a matter, again, of what we do to coach a medical professional or to inform a medical professional as to what it is that they're looking for on these applications.
Is there, now you meant everything we've been talking about is federal except for ODSP. Is there anything else provincial that we should be looking at?
There are a number of provincial benefits, and I think I can pop this up quickly.
Because some of our caregivers could be looking at this from different provinces. We get them from different countries, but we'll stay within Canada for now. Do you have clients from outside of Ontario?
Well, as I mentioned, we are opening in the Maritimes this year, which has opened a whole new can of worms for research, because a lot of this stuff flies under the radar, and there are far more programs out there than people are aware of. So there's your list of provincial programs. That's Ontario alone. And then on the federal side of things here, and some of them are being phased out. There's some sort of post-COVID stuff that's being phased out, and there are some niche ones such as the RARPD, which is for First Nations Canadians living on reserve. So there are a lot of different benefits out there that just, and again, they get missed.
That's quite a bit. And again, unfortunately, some of those might go.
The staycation tax credit is sunset. That's a post-COVID component, but some of them sort of do come and go as we see different governments take control of the helm.
Now, I do see CPPD, and that's become a very important financial resource for my wife and I. A good chunk of her income right now is coming from CPPD. You didn't mention that in the presentation that you and Janice did a couple of years ago. How much of a factor does that have to play in people's financial portfolio or in terms of their outlook?
It's huge, and it's absolutely huge. Now, obviously, in order to qualify, you must have contributed to CPP.
Of course.
But as far, each one of these programs have different qualification components and different maintain eligibility components. And CPPD is one of the less restrictive ones, or lesser restrictive, whereas ODSP has both an income test and an asset test. And they're very restrictive on how they calculate income. So they're all a little bit different in the way that those are done. But I find many Canadians who acquire a disability in their adult life, CPPD is sort of the first go-to. And it is a very good program. Now, it's not a ton of money, but it's more money than some of the others for sure. And it's not that difficult to qualify for or maintain.
And just for the viewers, CPPD is CPP disability. So it's Canada Pension Plan disability. We were told that it was more difficult to get CPPD than it was to get LTD, and then we tried to apply for the DTC, and that was even more difficult. There was a lot of, and I remember my wife, we saw the healthcare professional. He filled out all the forms, and she looked at that, and when she was really depressed, she was, "Am I that bad?" And I said, "Well, remember, the wording is important. It's not necessarily, he's not lying, he's not making anything up, but he's certainly not sugarcoating anything, and he's making them understand what it is, that why you need this credit, that type of thing." Now, the other thing that we found out, this is where the DTC really kicks in, is CPPD is fully taxable, and they don't take the tax off when they send it to you. You have to keep something back. But what we found is the DTC, the disability tax credit, more than offset any of the taxes that they would take off. That's why I wanted to bring up CPPD and mention it for people watching, is that it is an important thing to apply for. It's not retroactive, unfortunately, is it?
No,
Yeah.
no, CPPD is from date of approval onward. To the best of my knowledge, I've never seen a case where we've seen any kind of retroactive. Now, I will say most of the clients that come to us who are CPPD eligible are already receiving the benefit by the time they engage for our services.
Okay.
But on occasion, we have guided someone to complete an application of not seeing any retroactives.
Now, does that affect ODSP in terms of your income? I know you're allowed $1,000 a month on ODSP, and that doesn't count against you. CPPD would count against that, right?
CPPD and LTD do count against it.
They do count against it. What about for ODSP sale of personal assets? I think you talked about a gentleman who had been injured, who had been a trucker, and he sold his truck, and you use that as an example of how not to invest in an RDSP, and we'll get to that in a minute. Sale of personal assets, if you have too many assets, ODSP won't touch you.
That's right. So they have an asset limitation and an income limitation. Now, certain assets are exempt and others are not. So in the case where of long haul trucker sold his truck, his assets, he was allowed to contribute those assets. Really, this is a long one to unpack, but he's allowed to use those assets in certain ways that maintain the exempt status of it. And that can be handled in a certain way. Again, this would be a very unique situation and strategically deployed to make it eligible from the ODSP perspective. But generally speaking, ODSP allows an exemption for principal residence, which is not the case in Quebec. Principal residence is exempt in Ontario, and one vehicle, and that would be for the household. So selling that truck, but the truck was effectively a business asset. So now we get into this sort of limitation of $100,000 informal trust and these sorts of things that come into play. And then what do you do with the proceeds? And then if you invest it, is the growth. Now the growth is treated as income. So you're moving from the asset limitation to the income limitation, and it gets very complicated very quickly.
So the short answer is check with you guys. And
Somebody, a disability finance specialist who's very well versed in ODSP limitations, absolutely.
And give it some time. And I did mention the RDSP, the Registered Disability Savings Plan. You talked about some of the real advantages of that and why it's very, very important to get in on it early, before age 49. But you did talk about the carry forward function. You went into some detail on that, and I didn't quite understand what you meant by going 2 years at a time and up to a certain amount. Could you maybe explain that again?
Right. So you're allowed to reach back in time for eligible grants and bonds. So to the point of disability, the point in time where the disability occurred. Okay. So let's use the case of a motor vehicle collision.
Right.
In the case of an MVA, you've been in litigation for 6 years, you settled your file, now you have these proceeds to invest. And a lot of people think, well, I'm not going to bother with the disability tax credit while I'm on claim. I'm not receiving any money that's taxable. I have no tax exposure. I can't afford to contribute to an RDSP. So why would I open one? That's a big mistake. And actually, it does make sense to open one, even if you can't contribute, because if you are eligible for the disability tax credit, the bonds start going in immediately, right? And that's $1,000 a year. Free money. And again, now that starts compounding and growing, right? The growth starts to compound, and I can reach back to those past dated bonds, but not that growth. So if by chance you didn't, right, you settle your file 6 years later, you didn't open the RDSP, then what we can do is we can contribute for this year back too. So ideal contribution is $1,500 a year, because the government, depending on income and a few other things we won't get into for the sake of today's discussion, but let's say that you've no other source of income, and you've got this personal injury award. You invest $1,500 of that for this year, plus $1,500 for last year, plus $1,500 for the year before, and that allows you to capture that sort of maximum grant. Now there is
3 years.
So 3 years. So this year and back too. So now we're caught up for 3 of those 6 years, right? Mm-hmm. So then next year, you're going to invest for next year and back 2 more.
2 years before.
So then the following year, you would do that year, and we still have 1 year of catch up that we can invest for.
So someone who, for example, gets a settlement in 2024, let's put their age aside right now. They can file for 2024, or not file, but invest for 2024, also invest for 2023 and 2022.
Correct.
And then in 2025, they can invest for 25, 21, and 20. And so on.
Their accent was, let's say 2019. And then in 2026, they would do 2026 and 2019.
And now they're all caught up, providing they haven't hit the magical age of 59.
49.
49
is the last year to contribute. Because the other rule around the RDSP, and this is where we really got to be careful with this account, is it's last dollar in, first dollar out.
Right.
And it must be dormant. You must have 10 years of no contributions going into the account, or the government will take back the grants and bonds.
Now I understand, because I think the 49 and the 59 kind of confused me.
Right.
And, all right.
So you cannot contribute to the account after age 59. And with the exception of a state rollover, I believe, and I'm going to double check my rules on that one. Well, let's just leave it as, for the sake of today's discussion, no more contributions after age 59 whatsoever, but you cannot get any more grants or bonds after age 49. So ultimately, it has to sit for 10 years. So ultimately, in the calendar year in which the beneficiary turns 49, that should be the last year of contribution. Again, when we're talking in that world of motor vehicle collision, and we're talking about 6-7 years back, if the client settles at 47, there's not enough time to capture all of the backdated grants and bonds.
Because he's only got 2 years left.
Because he's only got 2 years to contribute. So we don't want to let this linger, and this is the mistake. This is one of the reasons why we created a service to help people navigate disability finance while they're recently injured and settling their claim, because these are the mistakes that get made that can be very costly. Right? If we get engaged with a person 1 year post-discharge of the hospital, or even in the year they are discharged from hospital, we can begin to set this up so that they can avail themselves of all of these government programs before the clock's run out.
As soon as possible. Now, what if you get someone in their mid-40s or their late 40s who's been injured and or may have been injured a while ago, but they're still waiting? Because tort settlements, ours took 7 years, right? It took a very, very long time to get our tort settlement, and then we had to sue our own insurance company, and that took a little while longer. So if someone comes to you early enough and doesn't have any money to put into an RDSP, can they borrow money, put it into the RDSP, and then reimburse themselves from the settlement? What kind of advice do you have for that person?
You can. So what you're asking is
In other words, defer their contributions, but they need to contribute as soon as possible.
Right.
But they don't have any money to do it yet.
There are other strategies that can be used there that I would go to before leveraging. So borrowing money to invest, or leveraged investing, is generally for people with a higher tolerance of
risk.
So it's not something that we generally advise on. What I would do in that situation is typically look to a family member to whom we can apply the disability tax credit, because it will increase their tax return. And then to offset that, what we would do is take the additional money out of that tax return, and that's what goes into the RDSP. So you can contribute to an RDSP without being out of pocket using that strategy.
Because one of the beauties that I noticed in your presentation of the RDSP as compared to our RSP is that the beneficiary and the holder don't have to be the same person.
Exactly right.
And that is amazing. Now, the person that is contributing does have to be someone who is connected to the disabled person.
Yeah, there has to be, in all things finance, we like to say there has to be a story to tell, and the story has to be believable. So there has to be a connection somewhere, that there is somebody, in order to qualify, in order to apply the disability tax credit, you're not going to apply that to your nephew who lives in Vancouver, because they're clearly not providing any care to you, and therefore why would they be able to avail themselves of the disability tax credit? That story has to be believable, but it could be someone who doesn't necessarily live in the same household, but does provide support and care, goes and gets groceries and helps get you to appointments and things like this. For sure, that person does not have to live in the household,
and they're not really picky on that. How many times do you get turned down for something like that?
I haven't had it happen yet. Again, though, with the experience that we have and the knowledge and rules and general rules of finance and tax, we're adhering to them. We're making sure, again, that the story is believable and it's legitimate.
All right. You mentioned in the presentation that because someone who starts an RDSP young and is not going to be using it until age 59, you can invest aggressively. What do you mean by that? What does that look like?
So when we talk about someone's portfolio, the greater portfolio, and you might have assets invested in several accounts, a tax-free savings account, a non-registered account. Maybe the person had an RRSP pre-accident, and now they're eligible to open an RDSP. When we talk about investment strategy, we look at a timeline. How much money do I need today, this year, next year, 3 years now, 5 years from now, 7, and how much do I need when I'm older, when I'm 60 years old and older? So when we talk about timelining money, generally speaking, the money that is timelined or earmarked to be used further out on that timeline, you can be more aggressive with it because it can ride out market changes. And the equities market tends to fluctuate far more than the fixed income market or the bond market. So bond market or, even GICs, this kind of thing, we keep those sort of in use for what's going to be needed in the short term, because of course, what we don't want to do is to have to draw down on money in a time when the market or the investments are down.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to realize a capital loss, particularly, or even reduce a capital gain. So if we know that this money is not going to be used until age 60, which of course in an RDSP it can't, because you can't start drawing down, well, unless you stop taking bonds and grants early and give that 10 years of dormancy. If we stop that, well, typically speaking, we're talking about age 60 and beyond, as that's when we're going to do it. So if the individual is in his or her 20s, we have a long time there to sort of capitalize on equities-based investing. Now, within the individual's tolerance for risk, obviously, and in my space, we're not putting that money in Bitcoin or in startups or private equity. That's a little too aggressive. We're talking about using sort of growth focused, maybe a tinge of emerging markets if the person has the stomach for it, equities based, managed investments, mutual funds, segregated funds, that sort of thing. Now, in an RDSP right now, mutual funds or exchange traded funds are generally what you would go to. Or if you're buying individual stocks and bonds, you can do that in there. But generally speaking, an ETF, an equities-based ETF or mutual fund is really going to be where to go. And you can build that person. If the person has a balanced risk tolerance, sort of 60-40 equities to fixed income kind of a mix on either end of that scale, we're generally going to put the heavier portion of the equities is going to be in the RDSP, because we know it has to be long-term money.
Long-term anyway.
Right. And then that allows us to get that compounded growth. That has two advantages. One, of course, you end up with more money. So you have a higher return overall in your portfolio. But two, when it comes to draw down, take money out of an RDSP, there's sort of the plan gets qualified as one of two things. Either a predominantly government contribution plan, or that the majority of, so meaning the government put in more than you did, right? Which isn't hard when when the government's contributing 3-to-1.
Pretty good.
Right, that's $3 for every dollar you put in there. It's pretty easy for the government to be the greater contributor to that, which then means there are restrictions on drawdown. If we contribute a little heavier or we get more growth in that account, then there are more assets in there from other sources other than the government, either growth or your personal contributions. So having a little more freedom in that account, if that's going to be the only pool of assets that we have to draw down in the ages 60 plus, having some freedom and flexibility in that account is very valuable. So we do, to the extent that the person's got an appetite for risk, we do want to make that one of the more aggressive accounts.
So aggressive meaning more aggressive mutual funds, which aren't really that aggressive.
Right, yes. We're still in the big safe world, nothing going down to zero, right? We're staying in that, but on that scale, right? As opposed to, I'm going to buy some Canada savings bonds. We're going to get a little bit more Google in there than Canada savings bonds.
All right. So within reason, what happens to an RDSP when it flips over at age 60 or 59, I guess it would be?
Does it become like, is it like a RIF? So in the calendar year in which you turn 60, January 1, you start drawing down on that account.
So it's like a RIF then.
That's very much like a RIF. So, and technically, by definition, it's actually very much like a trust, but the trust has rules, right? Because of government contributions, when it gets used, that's where we start to see how things come out. So at age 60, we start to draw down. And how much can come out of that account every year? There's a maximum of what you can take out of that account every year. So once things start to come out of that account, who contributed the most factors in, and then we want to make sure again that we're adhering to those rules and that you have the flexibility to take more if you need it.
So I do know that there is a $200,000 lifetime maximum on an RDSP. You did mention that. What would be an ideal scenario? What kind of growth are we talking about? What kind of payout are we looking at the age 60 when people start taking that? Can you,
That's really hard to speak to.
yeah, I figured
And
I'd ask anyway.
I understand. How did you put $200,000 in that account? When did you put $2,000 in that $100,000 in the account? What kind of return of investment did you have in
Right.
that account? All of that factors in, and everyone's tolerance to risk is different. Everyone's scenario is different. And as we spoke about, I think before we started recording, whether or not the RDSP was used for an estate rollover, that comes into play because when does that portion go in? How much of that versus how much were regular contributions? All of that factors into what would be eligible for payments out of the account.
So if someone got an inheritance or an estate rollover, or if someone wanted to take their RSP and roll it into someone else's RDSP, that you wouldn't do that all at once because again, you'd have to do it year by year. So for example, someone in their 20s or 30s is injured severely and can't work again. And someone else, Uncle Bob or Grandma or whoever wants to give them the RSP or the inheritance, you would then take that money and apply it a little bit at a time and
No,
put in the
because
investment of,
this is done in a state.
right,
So when a person, so grandma has been saving in her well, it's actually, I think it's parent to child. I'm not, oh, I'd have to, now I'm second guessing myself. It might be grandparent eligible as well, but let's for parent to child, because I know I'm safe in that.
let's stay with that.
So you've got a disabled child growing through life, contributing to the account, doing the $1,500 a year, getting nowhere near the maximum contribution to that account, coming through life. Mom moves to the great beyond. Let's say she's got $200,000 in her RRSP left
Right.
at the time of her passing. Under normal circumstances, what happens is that our RRSP is collapsed and it's paid directly into the estate
And taxed heavily.
and taxed heavily. At $200,000, that's near the maximum. And if there was any other source of income that year, chances are 54% of that has gone to income tax. So just for the sake of conversation, let's call it 50% at $200,000 is collapsed into that. That means for every dollar that goes into the estate, half goes to income tax. And
Right.
then there's also estate tax on top of that. And then whoever's managing the estate, there might be fees, there might be probating
Sure.
and all of these sorts of things that somebody can take advantage of. So a lot of that money can be lost to these sorts of things. Or if, let's say we have $100,000 or $150,000 of contribution room left in that RDSP, we can roll the 150 out of the RRSP directly into the RDSP dollar for dollar. And now let's say if it's 150 that moves, only 50,000 goes into the estate out of the RRSP. So now the estate pays less in tax and more of that 50 grand then goes to the heirs. So there's a lot of advantage to this account in estate planning.
But that 150,000 that you talked about, the hypothetical 150,000, that goes in all at once into the RD.
All at once, yes.
So you're not bleeding that in year after year to get the $1,500 tripled, that type of thing.
Right. So in that, depending on contribution room, depending on grants captured, et cetera, that's a calculation that gets performed at the time, right? Because is it more advantageous to avoid the income tax on the RRSP, or is it more advantageous to have extra contribution room to be able to trickle it in to capture more grants? So again, every file is extremely different because at that time, that calculation has to be done. And again, are you going to be able to find that if you walk into the bank? Are they going to know that? Probably not.
Which brings me to the last tool that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the new one, the latest little tool that's come down from the federal government. Who knows how long it's going to last or whether this is going to be a one-year thing. The Canada Caregiver Tax Credit. Could you maybe explain how that figures into the portfolio?
Sure. It is all of these tools that come out are really designed to provide some kind of equity to Canadians who are dealing with disability. And this is no different. Just like the disability tax credit was originally launched because they recognize that Canadians with disability have higher costs of living. So that was sort of offset with the tax credit. And then we realized quickly that that wasn't enough. And of course, that everybody had lost their ability to earn an income and therefore accrue room in an RRSP. So the RDSP was created. And again, some pay equity policies were put in by way of grants and bonds. So all of these things are sort of designed by the federal government at the time to provide some kind of equity. And now what's happened with this government is they recognize that caregivers suffer. Caregivers have less time to earn an income, have more costs because of that. They're restricted, so they try to offset that. In the case of a dependent child or a minor child, I should say, because we have adult dependents as well. In the case of a minor child, I believe it's $24.99 is the eligible credit. And then you can get up to $7,999 additional if you're dealing with a spouse or an adult dependent child. So they're just additional credits that you are able to apply for by way of your T1 general filing to attempt to bring back some of that money. Now, from the advocacy perspective, we like to sort of say, well, that's great. It helps out people who have tax exposure, but what about those who don't? So not a lot for them in these sorts of policies, but which is why the disability support payment is a really good one, because it's just straight up
Money.
net income based, and here's some cash, rather than here's some money back on your tax return. But this one is not one to be ignored for sure. And to your point, I hope it survives change in government.
Well, again, that we've talked about the political future. It's definitely up in the air. But again, maybe I have to talk to you again in a couple of years and find out what new tools are available, or what we've lost, or what we can no longer use. And again, it'll keep people like you on your toes, hopping and
Absolutely.
continually learning. And hopefully, more people end up at your door early enough to really take advantage of a lot of the tools that you're talking about. So thanks for talking to us today. I think this is going to be a very nice supplement to the presentation you did a couple of years ago. We're going to link to that. And I think caregivers gives them a lot to think about. At least it gives them a starting point, and they can access you on your website, get in contact with you if they don't have a healthcare professional that refers them, and hopefully at least get some silver lining to this very dark cloud that's often a caregiver's lot in life, and certainly survivors. So again, thanks for talking to us today, and maybe we'll be in touch soon. Thank you for your time.
Sounds good. Thanks for your interest. I appreciate
All
it.
right. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Bye-bye now.
Bye.